Hi everyone, here we are with the second video for week 2, our stimuli of the week in this case, number 2.2. Here we're looking at a chart. We're going to run through it, see what kind of breakdown we can get out of it, and what kind of questions we'll be able to pull from this particular topic. Right. So for this stimulus in particular, what we're looking at is the DTM, right? This is what you got to be able to recognize if you see this, and we can see that it's mostly unlabeled, right? We have birth rates per thousand, death rates per thousand on the sides is labeled, but we don't really have any labels outside of that, right? We have the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, but the lines themselves are not labeled. So we want to make sure that we can label these lines, right? That we can actually fill in what these lines are supposed to be, right? So this top line here, right, that drops second, right? We have this first line that drops first, and we'll go with this one actually first. All right, so the first line that drops, right, is our CDR, or death rates. All right, second line to drop is our birth rates, and the line at bottom to top is the total population / natural increase rate. Right, and the natural increase again is based on the slope of that line, right? The more, the greater the slope of the line, right? The faster that increase from one step to the next, the greater that increase rate is, right? The change in the total population is greater. That means a greater natural increase rate. Now, those are the basics behind this particular chart, right? So we may think of questions tied to this thing. So tied to this particular model, this particular theory. A lot that's going to have to do with development, right? So you want to be thinking about the chart that we've created before, or in the chart that we've looked at before. That's probably one of the biggest helps to you, right? And really we want to focus on maybe 3 different categories in particular, right? So if we're thinking of the DTM, right, we have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and stage 5. This will correspond to LDCs, NICs, and MDCs, and that may translate to primary, secondary, and tertiary economies. All right, we want to add another label here. We can also go to Wallerstein's theory, right, with our periphery, semi-periphery, and our core, right? So these areas are kind of the common threads, right, between the units, right, from this unit in particular with the DTM, the stages, to the types of countries we see, LDCs, NICs, MDCs, to the types of economies we see in countries, to the development category, right, the relationship between countries in Wallerstein's theory. Now, over time, of course, we want to know that from one end to the other, right here we have higher birth and death rates, and then we end up with lower births and death rates, right, over time. Coinciding with this is going to be changes in characteristics that are aside from birth and death rates, but that influence those birth and death rates on their own, right? So we can take a break from these particular spaces for a sec, right? And instead we may look at kind of different categories, right? So let's think about these categories in this sense, right? So we may have these characteristics, let's say education, healthcare, and what we might call infrastructure, right? So we're looking at these different categories, and what we're really searching for in this case is to understand how these categories differ between the stages, and then explaining those differences as we get into an actual FRQ response, right? So here, we're thinking about education, we can then just higher or lower, right? Higher or lower levels, right? So we may start with lower levels of education, greater levels of education, and then these would be where we see the highest levels of education. Healthcare, we have the least amount of access, greater access, and then eventually the greatest access, right? And that's going to be the trend that we see, right? As we get into these MDCs, the stage 4, stage 5 countries in the DTM, we're going to see the highest levels of education, the greatest access, the highest statistics, right? Or the most positive statistics of development. For infrastructure, we may have little to no infrastructure, right? We want to remember that infrastructure is things like our electricity, our roads, the ability of a state to be connected within itself, right? To get services to people, right? So in a less developed country, we may not have For example, electric access all over the country. Right, may have rural pockets in that country that just don't have the access to electricity, either at all or on a regular basis. We have some of these areas in the United States, for sure, and some other countries who are also classified as MDCs have this issue too, but it's to a much greater degree in LDCs. Right, we'll see a larger percentage of the population who has little to no access to electricity, right, is one example, in a less developed country in these stage 2 countries. Right here we'll have greater infrastructure, more development, and then we'll, of course, the greatest infrastructure in the MDCs. Now, of course, I want to be able to track these changes over time. Right? We want to know why these changes are happening. And in terms of education, that ties into these birth and death rates. Right? All of these are going to help transition into these demographic changes over time. Because the greater levels of education, we know that those birth rates and death rates drop for a number of different reasons. Right? Education in specific, right? Here's scrolling down a little bit. We know that education, especially for women, right? Because that's the group in the population where we're seeing the most impact or influence on birth rates and death rates in the population itself. So education, especially for women, normalizes and stabilizes birth rates and fertility rates. Right? They drop. Right? These birth rates and fertility rates drop as we see education increase in a country, especially for women in a country. Right? Because we know a number of things happen statistically. We read the statistics and can kind of infer back from that that a number of instances occur when that education access is increased. One, women attain higher levels of education. Right? Those, women included, with higher levels of education tend to have children later in life, so they're going to wait longer until they have their first child. And we know that those, women included, with higher levels of education, rather those who have children later in life, are less likely to have more children. Right? The later that you have your first child in life, the less likely it is that you're going to have a second, third, or fourth child. Right? So we see these kind of ripple effects, right? Increasing level of education in the country. And this is going to include sex and general education. Right? General education is a big equalizer. General education is a big equalizer, but sex education directly addresses this issue of birth rates and fertility rates. Right? General and sex education, and it's including things like family planning. It's including access to things like, we'll get to that in a sec, right, and family planning. As far as healthcare goes, this also goes hand in hand because with increased education access and with increased education in general, see increased access to these family planning services because we usually can find those at clinics or hospitals, and contraceptives. Right, whether they're being of use or not, just the mere access to these items, right? Even if we don't have a large proportion of the population using it, which of course, if they're using it, that's going to drop down birth rates and fertility rates. But even if the access is just increased, right? You take a country that has little to no access to contraceptives, family planning, and then a country that has the access, period, we're going to see big shifts in that fertility rate and those birth rates, right? Just as a matter of having those services or those items or those planning services available to families, right? We know that these are going to drop birth rates and death rates because they drop the cause of these increased birth rates and fertility rates directly, right? In terms of preventing pregnancies or encouraging a decrease in a birth rate, right? As far as infrastructure goes, this goes directly to the availability of hospitals, availability or access of hospitals, which if you have those access to hospitals, leads to greater access to all that was mentioned above. Family planning, contraceptives, sex education, general education. The more that we have this available, the greater that we're going to see these birth rates and fertility rates drop over time. Right? In addition to that, the greater access we have to hospitals, usually this means a greater access to medical care And really what we're looking at is what we call maternal care, prenatal care, and infant care. Right? Increased likelihood children will survive, and there's less need to have more children. Right? We've seen in a documentary before that we had a lot of high birth and fertility rates just because you never knew if your child was going to survive past a certain age. Right? So we see this change from the early 1900s to now, and from the 1800s to now, of these kind of family units where the average is maybe 5 or 6 kids per family, and now we're finally dropping into maybe 2 or 3 kids per family, right? And a lot of that was just because you didn't know if the child was going to survive at certain times and in certain regions. So families would have more children to help ensure the survivability of the family, right? And there are other pressures that happen too in terms of workforce needs, right? If you need children to help out in the home or help out with work, these are all kind of different factors that go into these different rates. All of this, these 3 things in particular, education, healthcare, infrastructure, are drivers of development, right? If these things aren't changing, if these things aren't improving over time, we don't get these demographic shifts either, right? So to move from that stage 2 to stage 3, you gotta have the greater healthcare access, you gotta have the greater infrastructure. Why are those in particular? Well, because what's the first thing that drops here? This is our death rate. And death rate is the first thing to drop down. So in order to get to stage 2 in the first place, we need to have greater healthcare, greater infrastructure. To move to that stage 2 to stage 3, both of these rates have to drop. So we need better healthcare than we did before, but we also need to start increasing, 1, access to education, especially for women. 2, make sure that access includes things like general education and sex education, access to healthcare, family planning, contraceptive services, and increased prenatal and maternal care. To finally make your way to stage 4, stage 5, you need to have all that stuff together, plus greater ease of access, right? So we can have large portions of populations who don't have access to any of these 3 facets, any of these 3 factors, education, healthcare, infrastructure. Once you get to stage 4 and 5, you want a majority of people to have access to these services, even if it's not the easiest of accessibility, right? And we even have variation there between different MDCs, right? We've looked at this before in class, right? The U.S. maybe doesn't do the best with access to healthcare in certain regards, but does better in other aspects in terms of infrastructure, education. Other countries may do better or worse in other regards too. It's going to depend, it's going to shift, but generally we're going to see most people have easier access to these changes and easier access to these services in the stage 4, stage 5, these MDCs, than we do in these stage 2 and stage 3s. And all of that is because these different characteristics of development change and shift over time. Education improves, healthcare improves, infrastructure improves, and then we get all the demographic changes, right? All of this change happens first, and then we can start to categorize, right? Now we see the birth rates drop, now we see the death rates drop. So when you think through the DTM, think through a stimulus like this one, these are kind of the changes you want to have in mind, right? And we can tie this too to the economy, right? Because as you're developing, more people are educated, they get higher level jobs. That means that you get paid more, and that means you can move up in the sectors of the economy. The healthcare, right? More people are living, which means you don't have to be focused on the home as much in terms of having more kids. So that also enables women to go out into the workforce or go out and get a higher level of education than before. The infrastructure means that there are more jobs needed, right, to build the systems, right, to work in the electrical plants, to work in the hospitals, to build the hospitals in the first place. And all the things kind of cycle together. They go hand in hand. As long as you have that together, right, in your head, and you're thinking of kind of this story of development where all these different chapters develop and change, and you're on the right track, right? And this is development, kind of in a nutshell and condensed, right? Looking at these different changes, especially in these 3 regards, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and then seeing those changes play out in what we call a DTM, right? Making a stage 2, but also being able to see what sorts of things need to happen to move to stage 3, to move to stage 4 in this model. As always, hopefully this was helpful to you and it helps you plan your responses and answer your assignments. Here's hoping, as always, that you're happy, healthy, and safe, and we'll see you next time.